What does it mean to be the strongest? Is it physical strength? Then what about cunningness? How much does experience play in a world full of talent? Does it mean you're the scariest? Or is it simply the one who could kill any and everyone who challenges them? I don't know how this intro is going to turn out. It may turn out to have been a very creative idea or a very corny one. Why don't you guys let me know? So anyways, how's it going, everyone? I hope you all are having a wonderful day. I'm a mess, and today I wanted to talk about this manga I've been reading called Vagabond. Now, Vagabond is an incredibly popular series which was written by Takehiko Inoue, who also wrote Slam Dunk, one of the greatest sports mangas of all time. Vagabond is based off a novel called Musashi, which was written by a famous historical novelist, Eiji Yoshikawa. Now, Eiji Yoshikawa is famous for rewriting historical novels and making them more accessible for newer readers to the historical fantasy genre. For example, he took the original manuscript of a book called Taiko that was apparently 15 volumes long and rewrote it into a 2-volume series. Now, I looked into it, and I don't know if he rewrote Musashi or if it's his own original work. Either way, Takehiko Inoue wrote Vagabond based off of Eiji Yoshikawa's telling of it. Now, I don't know how much they resemble each other. My initial assumption is that there were some changes made to allow the story to flow more smoothly in manga format, which I'm gonna go ahead and say it doesn't take away from the original story. Even though I never read the novel, I could tell from how Takehiko puts in a lot of detail about Musashi's mentality that he got as closely as he possibly could to the original material. Throughout the entire story, I get the sensation that this all came from a novel. Even though it does say in the manga that this was inspired by one, it's just the writing style focuses more on the metaphysical essence of swordsmanship rather than technique and skill that we can physically see. I'll get more into that when I begin discussing the actual story, but before I jump into the plot, I first want to say, when I first heard about the series, I didn't know it was a fictional telling of Miyamoto Musashi's life. I thought it was just some random samurai. For those of you who don't know who Musashi is, he's considered to be one of the greatest ronin, or wandering samurai, in the history of Japan. And his most famous duel is probably his duel against Sasaki Kojiro, where he killed him, which anyone who has looked into famous Japanese samurai or even seen the Record of Ragnarok anime on Netflix would have known this. So yeah, sorry if some people consider this to be a spoiler, because this is a well-known historical event. It's not really a spoiler. It's like telling anyone watching a Queen Mary drama that Queen Mary dies at the end, or anyone watching the Hamilton musical that Alexander Hamilton dies at the end. It's not really a spoiler because it's a famous historical event. Don't worry, the manga hasn't reached that point yet, so the author could still move some pieces around and make the ending different than how it actually was recorded in history. And despite us knowing how it's going to end, it doesn't diminish the journey. The story that is told to get us to that point is still worth it at the end of the day. So for those who don't want any more spoilers, I can say this. Vagabond is the story of a wandering samurai who goes from a boorish brute to one of Japan's most famous swordsmen. We see his growth and development, as well as slowly begin to see him create his famous sword style. And all of this is depicted in a philosophical tale filled with blood and death. So from this point, the video will contain more spoilers, because I can't talk about Musashi's philosophy and how he developed it without talking about the battles and characters who helped him come up with it. The same thing with Sasaki Kojiro. His fights show just how different he is to Musashi, and really set him up as Musashi's rival. But I will primarily focus on Musashi's storyline. So the story first begins post-battle of Sekihagara. Now, I do want to go over this battle as well as the events that led up to it, because it sets the tone of the story. It's also very relevant for the time period the story takes place in. And the story itself doesn't explain it very much, because it is assumed that you have some knowledge of the battle. And if you're like me and don't have a degree in Japanese history, then some of the details go over your head and you miss the significance of certain names and factions that get mentioned. So before we talk about the battle, let's talk about the events leading up to it. First, we're going to talk about the Onin War, which took place between 1467 and 1477. This was a war between a high official named Hosokawa Katsumoto and a regional lord named Yamana Sozen. This war began over a feud about who will succeed the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Yoshimasa had convinced his brother Ashikaga Yoshimi to give up his life as a monk and join him as his eventual heir. However, shortly thereafter, Yoshimasa's wife, Hino Tomiko, gave birth to a son. Tomiko then allied herself with a regional lord, Yamana Sozen, in an attempt for her to become the temporary ruler until her son was old enough to lead himself. However, they were met with opposition by Ashikaga Yoshimi, who had the support of the Hosokawa clan, who potentially had the most influence during that time. This dispute eventually led to a civil war between the two factions, which the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa and his group also had to get involved in. They considered the aggression by Tomiko and Yamana as an act of rebellion. The two sides fought to a stalemate, which ended up causing the several warrior clans to form their own factions. Throughout this point, there were constant switches of puppet rulers and those who controlled them behind the scenes. That is, until a very powerful daimyo overthrew the Ashikaga shogunate with his superior military might in 1573. And that daimyo was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was eventually betrayed by one of his retainers, Akechi Mitsuhide, in 1582, which is referred to as the Honnoji Incident. 2 weeks later, Nobunaga's loyal retainer Totoyomi Hideyoshi avenged him in the Battle of Yamazaki, then proceeded to finish what Nobunaga started and conquered all of Japan. He then ruled until his death in 1598. His son Toyotomi Hideyori took over, but was eventually displaced by Tokugawa Ieyasu in the Battle of Sekigahara in the year 1600, which then established the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, how does this relate to Vagabond? Well, the story takes place with our protagonist, Takezo Shinmen, who would later be known as Miyamoto Musashi, and his best friend, Matahachi Honoden, leaving that very battle. They had apparently fought on the losing side, which means they fought for Toyotomi Hideyori. As such, they left the battlefield without accomplishing anything. They had intended to become famous because of this war, and all they did was apparently show up. We later learned that Takezo at least did something while Matahachi faked being dead in order to avoid fighting. They eventually reunited with each other and left the battlefield only to be spotted by refugee hunters. They attempted to kill the pair, but Takezo brutally beat them to death with whatever he could get his hands on. Being unarmed at the time, Takezo resorted to using his hands, large boulders, and tree branches to brutally kill these hunters. This was our first display of Takezo's brute strength and lack of remorse. Afterwards, both him and Matahachi fell ill from lack of food and hydration, as well as a lot of unsanitized cuts and wounds. They were saved by a woman and her daughter who were living in the mountains and robbing corpses to make a living. Takezo ended up saving them from a group of mountain bandits who were constantly harassing them, while Matahachi slept with the woman. Matahachi, believing Takezo was slain by the bandits, left with the woman and her daughter and went to Kyoto to start a new life, abandoning his fiancée back at home as well as his family and position as the head of the village. By the way, Takezo did not pass away. He easily defeated the bandits and quickly deduced that Matahachi left with the woman and her daughter. So Takezo decided to return back to their village to inform Matahachi's mother that he is alive. However, Matahachi's mother, Osugi Honoden, is furious with Takezo because she blames him for her son leaving to battle in the first place, when he should have taken her place as the head of the village. And since Takezo fought for the losing side, it wasn't difficult to convince public officials to send guards to arrest him. Takezo used his brutish fighting style to fend off his pursuers, only to be captured by a monk named Takuan Soho. This monk was well beloved by many lords for his brutal honesty and quick wits. He had befriended a lot of high-ranking officials, so no one could see anything when he took charge of Takezo and wished to carry out his punishment himself. Takuan hung Takezo up in a tree for several days in order for him to reflect on what he has been doing with his life. During that time, Matahachi's former fiancé, Otsu, would bring him food. Otsu was close friends with both Takezo and Matahachi, and despite being engaged to Matahachi, she had always cared deeply for Takezo. She wasn't aware that she was in love with him just yet, but she figures it out shortly thereafter. While up in the tree, Takezo remembers his father, who was considered to be the strongest swordsman under the heavens. His father drove his wife away with his brutish mentality, and was even willing to fight and kill his own son, who had sought to challenge and surpass him as the strongest. Takezo slowly came to realize that he wants to become the strongest, and not by simply overpowering his opponent with monstrous strength. He wants to be a true swordsman. After being up in the tree for a few days, a man visited Takezo. This man is Kohei Tsujikaze, the younger brother of the banner leader whom Takezo killed. This man held a grudge against Takezo for killing his brother, not because he cared for him, but because he wanted to kill him instead. And before Kohei could do anything to Takezo, Takuan showed up and scared him away. He then proceeded to take Takeo away with him. After giving him some time to contemplate about what he's been doing and what he plans to do with the rest of his life, Takuan claims Takezo Shinmen is now dead, and he is now reborn as Miyamoto Musashi. Then both him and Otsu saw Musashi off. What Takuan was attempting to do was show Musashi the value of life and what it means to actually take one. Now, Takuan didn't actually care if Takezo was killing people or not. Despite being a monk, he didn't have any qualms with swordsmen killing each other in pursuit of improving their swordsmanship. The reason he was so harsh on Takezo was because Takezo was just brutally murdering his opponent, instead of using their defeat, or in this situation, their deaths, to improve himself. Takezo was just killing them to get them out of his way, instead of using them as stepping stones to improve his skills. In other words, everyone whom Takezo has killed pretty much died a pointless death. That is where Takuan had a problem. That is why he hung up Takezo in a tree, to teach him what it means to die, what it means to be afraid of death. If he has to kill someone, let it be to prolong his own life. Now, it may have seemed like Takezo, who now goes by Musashi, took Takuan's lessons to heart, but as we soon see, that wasn't the case. After he left, Musashi then spent the next 4 years refining his swordsmanship. Then he traveled to Kyoto to take on the legendary Yoshikawa sword school. He had hoped to challenge the elder brother, Seijudo, but was greeted by the younger brother, Denshichido, instead. Before facing off against the younger brother, Musashi had to take on some of the students to prove his worthiness. Now this is where the story started to go downhill. Despite reflecting on how he was fighting while being hung up in the tree for several days, and receiving words of enlightenment from Takeuan, Musashi mercilessly killed some of the students he was challenging. This was a huge shock to me because Takeuan pretty much told him to seek strength without needlessly taking another's life. He taught him to take life if it was necessary. But here we see Musashi pulling the same stunt Takazo was pulling before, treating people's lives as nothing more than insects blocking his path to becoming the strongest. This action earned the ire of Denshichido Yoshikawa, who managed to fight Musashi to a draw. They ended up postponing their match for 1 year, so they could both go out and train, so they could fight each other at their peak. Also, there was this issue with the dojo having caught fire. Turns out the one who had set the dojo on fire was Matahachi. In the 4 years since he left with the woman and moved to Kyoto, the woman and her daughter became prostitutes. They were highly coveted to the point that the daughter Akemi caught the eye of Seijudo Yoshikawa. Despite being a notorious womanizer, he seemed to have fallen in love with Akemi. Now, due to Oko and Akemi being very popular, Oko being Akemi's mother, Matahachi was not seen as Oko's husband, but her pimp instead. So despite him having abandoned Takazo, presumably for dead, and leaving his fiancée for another woman, he then was treated as someone who was just there being a burden. Instead of starting a new life together, Oko saw Matahachi as a bum and kicked him to the curb, and then started working in a brothel to make a living. Matahachi kept trying to act like they were still together, but Oko made it very clear that she wants nothing to do with his broken, lazy ass. At this point, Matahachi's depicted as being lazy scum who made impulsive decisions that landed him in the gutters. He then noticed that Takazo was not only alive, but was also challenging the Yoshikawa, and he was just as strong as the younger brother Denshichido. Feeling anger to the Yoshikawa and jealousy towards Takazo, currently Musashi, Matahachi decided to aid Musashi by drinking the Yoshikawa's alcohol supply. Not joking. He literally got drunk off of their sake and dropped the candle into the giant crate of alcohol, setting the dojo on fire. He was of course spotted fleeing the dojo, so the members of the Yoshikawa knew he did it, and pursued criminal charges against him for it. So not only do we have the protagonist not having grown or developed after a touching moment where it seemed like he did, we then get his best friend, who was set up as his rival and equal, turned out to be a lazy drunk who no longer trained in swordsmanship. This is the second arc of the story, and it literally made me lose a lot of interest in the series. If I didn't like the author and his art style, I would have literally dropped this series after this moment. I hung in there though and moved on to the next arc. Oh, I forgot to mention this other character, Toji Gion, who was the right hand to Seijudo and one of the Yoshikawa's strongest swordsmen. After witnessing Musashi's fight, he felt that he too could grow to greater heights, and left the Yoshikawa to train. This becomes relevant later on, so keep him in mind. In the next arc, we learn a little more about Musashi. He meets an old man whom we later learn is named Ine Hozuin, who was a famous spear wielder who was currently retired. When Musashi first saw him, he sensed a ferocious bloodlust that caused Musashi to jump back and draw his blade. Ine then explained that he had no bloodlust at that moment, and the bloodlust Musashi was sensing was actually his own being reflected off of Ine. Musashi had wanted to challenge Ine Hozuin, who had achieved the title of strongest, not realizing that it was this frail old man in front of him. Of course, Ine did tell him that the man he was looking for was retired, and that one of his students is currently stronger than him. After hearing this, Musashi continued to the Hozen temple, where he found Ine's student, Inshin Hozuin. At first, Musashi is confident he can defeat him, but is easily overwhelmed. After realizing he was no match for Inshin, Musashi chose to flee the battle. He did this off of pure instinct and not of his own free will. Afterwards, Musashi felt a great sense of shame. Not only did he run from a fight, but he also realized that he was afraid to die. For most of the series thus far, we see Musashi having asked for death, run into a fight that would have surely killed him, and even risked his life to challenge a strong opponent. Throughout all of these endeavors, Musashi never thought that he could die. Even if he did, he had stated he is not afraid of death. He was afraid of being weak. Yet at this moment, he turned and fled when he realized he was going to die. As a result of this, Inshin began patrolling the forest around the temple with a real spear, and not the training one he used in his fight with Musashi. This time around, Inshin had no intention of giving Musashi a chance to escape. However, Ine found him first and treated him. He even went out of his way to show Musashi his flaws. He trained him in order to fight his student, because he had hoped Musashi would teach Inshin the meaning of fear, seeing as how Musashi was just taught that himself. he was motivated to go through whatever training Inoue had in store for him. After his training, Musashi felt like a completely different person both physically and mentally. He then met up with Inoue in the middle of the night to avenge his previous defeat. Only this time he wasn't facing Inoue as a wild animal looking to pounce on its prey, but as a calm and calculating swordsman looking to defeat his opponent. Inoue had come into this battle wielding a sharp and pointy spear that could kill Musashi with a single well-placed strike, while Musashi was wielding a wooden sword. Despite this, neither side could make a move. Inoue knew that Musashi could easily kill him with that wooden sword if he were to make a single mistake. This was completely different than their first fight, where Inoue was not afraid or hesitant to attack Musashi. We see exactly how skilled Musashi is with him, only taking about a week or so to train and become a completely different fighter. This battle takes place over the course of a few chapters, with both sides taking their time to feel out their opponent, but in the end, Musashi managed to get a clean strike onto Inoue, knocking him unconscious. Afterwards, Musashi quickly reverted back to his boorish personality and proceeded to beat Inoue's unconscious body while screaming, "I am strong! I am strong!" over and over again. It appears he may have killed Inoue, but fortunately he resumed breathing, and Inoue and another one of his students took Inoue back to the temple to get medical treatment. Unfortunately, Musashi had understood what it meant to be a true swordsman only for a short while, then reverted back to his primal self. This isn't the first time this has happened, and neither would it be the last. It's constantly shown that Musashi doesn't retain the knowledge he acquires throughout his journey. He takes 2 steps forwards, then 1 step back. Yes, I said that right. He does make progress, but then regresses. Not further back than when he was. He still became strong, but his mentality did return to its previous self. This is one of the most disappointing things about Vagabond. Well, that and Matahachi, who we see is working as a lowly stone carrier for a construction team. He eventually gets sick from the heat and stress, but a man with scars on his face gives him medicine and asks him to keep an eye out for guards for him. Matahachi agrees, but he wasn't paying attention, and the guards catch the man drawing the palace they are constructing. Assuming him to be a spy, they beat him to death. With his last breath, this man lets out the words, "Please," to Matahachi as he dies. So Matahachi decides to search his person to see if he can find anything to indicate who he was and where he came from so he can relate to his family his passing. He then found a sword certificate for a Sasaki Kojiro saying he mastered the Chuji Ryu style. So he had assumed this man was Sasaki, which I was bothered by because it had been depicted that Kojiro was a good-looking man with long hair. So this brute with short hair and scars on his face didn't match any of the mental images I had for Kojiro. Then what makes this worse is that Matahachi went around impersonating Kojiro. He even used the name to hustle people out of their money. This made me worry that this is what Sasaki Kojiro surmounted to in Vagabond. Luckily, there is more to it, so I will talk about it when we reach that point. However, in the meantime, Matahachi continues to impersonate Kojiro, scaring off any would-be challengers just by saying that name. Then an actual samurai shows up and challenges him to a duel. This man has heard of the Ganryu style that Kojiro had perfected and wished to witness it firsthand. Matahachi, afraid of revealing he's not Kojiro, accepted, but after they travel some distance away, pushed the samurai and his companion off a hill and fled. This scene erased all hopes of seeing Matahachi become Musashi's rival, and even infuriated me to the point that I would just skim through Matahachi's moments. We then go back to Musashi as he heads for the Yagyu estate in search of the head of the estate and sword school, Seki Shusai Yagyu, a man who similarly to Inoue had gained the title of strongest for his swordsmanship. We learn a little about him, like how him and Inoue had studied under the same master, and that is where they learn what it truly means to be the strongest. Also forgot to mention this, but Otsu is living with him as a daughter figure as in he never officially adopted her, but considers her as a part of his family. They both spend a lot of time with each other, and Seki Shusai explains to her what his master taught him about what being the strongest means. He straight out just states that the strongest can make his opponent lose the will to fight without drawing his blade. He even displays this when a man sneaks into the estate and attacks him. This man is actually Toji Gion. After traveling for some time, he decided to test his strength by trying to assassinate Seki Shusai. However, Seki Shusai easily defeated him with a single palm thrust to the stomach. No, he's not a martial artist, but he simply swung his arm like they were a blade and slammed it into his opponent's chest. He then had Gion escorted off the premises. We also see that Denshi Chido is also there, and he had been there for several months now trying to receive training from Seki Shusai. To no avail. Seki Shusai had been declining all requests for personal training, even those from a person from a prestigious school. Meanwhile, Musashi ends up meeting a unique man whom he can instantly tell is strong, and even seems to have a similar mentality to Musashi, just not as boorish as his. This man is Hyogonosuke Yagyu, the grandson of Seki Shusai and his successor. Elated by this meeting, Musashi spent some time reflecting on it at the local inn outside of the Yagyu estate. At the same inn, we see Otsu delivering Denshi Chido a note and a pawnee flower. The letter states that Seki Shusai had no intention of training anyone anymore, and he's on the verge of retiring soon. He apologized to Denshi Chido for not being able to see him. Denshi Chido is enraged by this, but seeing as how it was a woman who delivered the message, he really couldn't force her to take him to Seki Shusai. Otsu then left and took the peony flower with her because Chido didn't have an inkling for flowers, so Otsu just gave it to one of the staff members. This staff member then proceeded to bring food to one of the guests, who just so happened to be Musashi. He instantly noticed the flower and proceeded to cut it. He then stared at the two halves of the flower. We later learned that he noticed something special with the original cut, and the part he cut was nowhere near as clean. This is where we see Musashi grow a bit as a swordsman. His senses begin to heighten and he starts to understand the beauty of sword swinging. Unfortunately, he still has that boorish personality of his, so his development gets cut short. Suspecting that this flower was cut by a master, he sends a letter to the Yagyu estate asking who had cut it. The four top students knew that the only person here who was growing peony flowers would be their master Seki Shusai. Surprised that this random wanderer was asking about it, the four students decided to invite him to the estate and have a discussion about swordsmanship with him. Musashi accepted, seeing as this was the only way for him to get into the estate. During this dinner, the top student asked Musashi why he was curious about the flower. Musashi then explains that the flower had a very unique cut to it. Normally, when something delicate like a flower stem is cut, it doesn't get sliced, it actually gets torn. So the end will look rough. However, this one was smooth, indicating that it wasn't torn, but cleanly sliced. The four students looked at the stem and couldn't tell the difference between the two. In that moment, they knew Musashi was a prodigy and had admitted that it was the master Seki Shusai who had cut it. Musashi was relieved, because if it had been a student who had did it, then the master would have been far superior and completely out of his league. Then a commotion broke out outside and Musashi took advantage of it to go searching for Seki Shusai's lodging. After running around and fighting the members of the Yagyu school, he eventually ran into Otsu, who had hidden him. Musashi then snuck away and found Seki Shusai asleep. He then drew his blade to kill this sleeping old man, which again bugged me because Musashi's mentality is still that of the strongest is whoever is still alive. So this type of action is okay in his mind. He doesn't view it as a dishonorable way of fighting, because it's his opponent's fault for not being more aware even in his sleep. But then Seki Shusai pulls out what at first appears to be a spear, but then Musashi realizes that it was a back scratcher. Now Musashi gets a few flashbacks to his father. When Musashi was younger, he tried to kill his father in his sleep, only to see that his father had a spear waiting for anyone who came after him. We also learned that Musashi's father defeated both Seki Shusai and Inoue in a tournament a few years ago, and became recognized as the strongest under the heavens. Musashi was surprised to see someone who was comparable to his father not being armed while they slept. He then tried again to kill him, only to have his sword blocked by the back scratcher. This is where a lot of symbolism gets used, with the back scratcher twisting around Musashi's blade, stopping it in its tracks. It was a display of skill rather than brute strength. Then it turns out that Seki Shusai was awake and had begun having a discussion with Musashi. He told Musashi that invincible and strongest were merely words. Musashi had begun to slowly realize that his father's strength was also his weakness. He feared everyone and everything. His own bloodlust and desire to be the only one who was considered invincible made everything around him seem like an enemy, including tree trunks and branches. Musashi was in awe of both Inoue, who had told him about how bloodlust can reflect off of someone back to you, and Seki Shusai for showing him what true strength looks like. And like I've stated earlier, Musashi has a tendency where whenever he takes 2 steps forward, he takes 1 step back. As he continues his travels, he gets so caught up with how much stronger he has gotten and how much higher he can climb, he didn't notice a wooden plank with the nails sticking out of it, and he stepped right on it. Musashi was disappointed with himself because Inoue had warned him that if he focuses solely on finding a single tree, he will miss the entire forest. That saying had been foreshadowing this moment since the Hozuin arc. He got so caught up in his strength that he was no longer looking in front of him, both physically and metaphorically. We then go back to Matahachi, who was reunited with his mother and uncle, who had been traveling in search of Musashi and Otsu. Osugi had been chasing the both of them for revenge for having lost her son, and because Otsu refused to join their family. After traveling together, Matahachi runs into the samurai who had challenged him prior. This man realized that Matahachi was a fake and tried to kill him, only to be killed by a famous mountain bandit who wields a unique weapon called the chain sickle. It's a dexterous weapon which implements a sickle and an iron ball attached together by a long chain. This mountain bandit was named Baiken Shishido. Him and his daughter Rindo were living in the mountains, where the reputation of Baiken drew in swordsmen from all around the country, including Musashi. When Musashi confronted Baiken, he was surprised to see that Baiken knew him. As it turns out, the original Baiken was dead. This man had killed him and took up his weapon, and he was taught by Rindo in the art of the chain and sickle, which caused the name of Baiken to spread around the country. Then this man revealed himself to be Kohei Tsujikaze, the bandit whose brother Musashi killed back in the first arc. We then learned that Kohei had lived his entire life as someone who kills people naturally and with no hesitation. However, when he became Baiken and was taking care of this little girl, he was no longer living his life just to kill. Despite this, he still fought Musashi with everything he had, and in the end, Musashi cut this man's fingers off along with a deep gash into his shoulder. Baiken can now no longer wield a weapon, so he states that the cycle of death is now over. He is free from fighting, and he can now live together with Rindo as a family. Musashi doesn't quite understand what he means by the spiral of killing, but he learns that Baiken became strong for someone else. He doesn't learn anything from this in the immediate aftermath, but it becomes important later on. We also see that Matahachi was watching this battle, and when he went back to his family, he saw that his uncle was cut down by a swordsman who was traveling with the previous samurai, and so ashamed that his actions caused his uncle to die, he fled, leaving his mother alone to travel on her own. Then we go back in time to 17 years prior, where a former sword instructor named Jisai Kanemeki receives a letter saying a woman is sending her son over to him because her and her husband are about to die in a war. Apparently this child was the son of one of his former students, and they had no one to send him to. He finds the boy in an abandoned boat with nothing but a giant katana. This boy is named Sasaki Kojiro. We then see Kojiro's upbringing and how he was always drawn to the sword. Then one of Jisai's former students, Ito Itosai, visits him and immediately recognizes that Kojiro is deaf and mute. As the boy grows older, he continually seeks sword training from Jisai, who refuses. He has no intention of teaching someone who can't hear his opponent because he knows he will die a quick death. After repeated battles, Kojiro adapts to Jisai's underhanded tactics, but continues to be defeated. That is until Itosai witnesses one of their fights, and punches Kojiro. He then yells at Kojiro for holding back against his master. Of course, Kojiro doesn't hear this, but the purpose of him yelling that was for Jisai to understand that Kojiro was holding back. Itosai explains that Kojiro is stronger than Jisai and offers to take him on as his student. After they leave, Jisai writes out a sword certificate for Sasaki Kojiro and gives it to Kojiro's best friend and the only other person in the village who had fought alongside him. And this was the guy who ended up running into Matahachi and as a result died of his actions. So this man was trying to take the sword certificate to his closest childhood friend but met an untimely demise. And Kojiro, being unaware of this, continued traveling with Itosai. After a series of grueling and life-threatening experiences, including one where they head to the Battle of Sekigahara, we see Kojiro is a natural swordsman with unparalleled skills. In the aftermath of Sekigahara, Itosai calls over a group of soldiers for Kojiro and Musashi, who was Takezo back then, to fight. Takezo just happened to run into them but recognized that they weren't soldiers. This is the first time we see the both of them together, and it foreshadows their inevitable rivalry. Kojiro spent the rest of the day and night fighting against soldiers and hunters until he defeated them all. Despite this, Kojiro found it enjoyable fighting against the strong, but detested fighting a group of weak opponents. This showed us that Kojiro views swordsmanship as a game and something that he enjoys doing. We then cut back to the present where Musashi, Kojiro, and Matahachi all made their way back to Kyoto. There we see Seijuro Yoshioka having an intimate relationship with Akemi. While that happens, Denshi Chido prepares for his duel with Musashi, and he is terrified. He could tell Musashi had gotten stronger while he hasn't improved one bit. And the most shocking thing of all is that we see Toji Gion, who is considered to be among the strongest swordsmen in Yoshioka, reduced to a shell of his old self. He tried to travel and grow like Musashi, but was reduced to nothing. He tried to fight Musashi, but was instantly cut down. We see how not anyone can travel throughout the country and attain strength. Many people try, but most of them end up the same as Gion, a broken man reduced to nothing. Leading up to the fight, Musashi got the sensation that someone was watching him, so he eventually left the inn he was staying at and camped just outside of town. There, we see Seijuro sneaking up on Musashi and throwing a knife at the back of his head. Musashi quickly sensed it and deflected it. Now Musashi got what he was after a year ago, a duel against the older Yoshioka. Seijuro was apparently leagues ahead of his younger brother, despite the younger being larger in frame and spending more time training. It was clear which of the two were superior. Now this duel was one where both sides sought to protect something precious to them, Musashi's sword and Seijuro's brother. In the end, Musashi was victorious, which sent a shock throughout Kyoto. Now, two things became abundantly clear in the aftermath. One being that Yoshioka will not forgive the death of one of their own, and also the recognition that Musashi will definitely defeat Denshi Chido. Many members of the Yoshioka tried to convince Denshi Chido to allow a proxy to fight Musashi in order to preserve the future of the Yoshioka. Denshi Chido refused and ended up dueling with Musashi, where he met the same fate as his brother. These two fights helped Musashi grow and begin to refine his sword style, to the point where in his duel with Denshi Chido, he forgot to draw his blade and swung his arm instead. This foreshadows Musashi understanding the words of Yagyu: invincible is only a word, it holds no meaning. Seek to be the strongest, and you can, but you will never be truly strong. True strength comes from those who can defeat their opponent without having to draw their blade. In that moment, we get the idea that Musashi understood those words subconsciously, hence why he didn't realize he didn't draw his blade. But consciously, Musashi believes that in order to be the strongest, you need to kill all of your adversaries by cutting them down. Something like using his arm to overwhelm his opponent without killing them wasn't a concept. He has killed with his bare hands before, but breaking his opponent's spirit and will to fight wasn't a concept that he understood, hence why he kills Denshi Chido. After this, Denshi Chido's right-hand man, Ryohei Ueda, gathered the remaining members of the Yoshioka and planned to ambush Musashi. However, Musashi overheard their plans and attempted to leave via a different route. However, the temptation to fight against 70 skilled swordsmen at the same time wasn't something he could walk away from, so he quickly ambushed their most skilled member, Ryohei Ueda, and began cutting down the other members one after the other. This proved to be one of the most difficult endeavors Musashi had ever faced. Unlike the Battle of Sekigahara and the Kyojido flashback, these swordsmen were highly skilled, so one wrong move would mean the end of Musashi. After much time and effort, Musashi had succeeded in defeating all 70 members, or so he thought. He went to retrieve his sword, which he threw at an enemy early on, and there were the final two surviving members pretending to be corpses, one of which was Ryohei, who had survived his initial assault. The first guy jumped in front of Musashi while Ryohei attacked from behind. Musashi dealt with the first guy with ease, but was incredibly exhausted to the point that he couldn't react to Ryohei's attack. Ryohei ended up not dealing a lethal blow, but he did the next best thing and sliced Musashi's calf, practically crippling him. In the end, Musashi was victorious but severely wounded. If it wasn't for Matahachi, who found him wandering the city at night, Musashi would have died. He managed to get treatment for all of his wounds except for the one on his calf. He struggled to walk but refused to give up. He was then arrested for killing the 70 members of the Yoshioka, but it was just a pretext because the officials of Kyoto feared Yoshioka members who weren't in Kyoto at the time, as well as would-be swordsmen looking to make a name for themselves, would be coming for his life. Now, the results of this battle quickly spread throughout Japan and reached the ears of the Hosokawa clan. That name should sound familiar from my prelude to the Vagabond explanation. They were the most powerful noble clan in all of Japan, and they sought out Musashi in order to make him one of their sword instructors. While Musashi was in jail, he received frequent visits from Takuan, who was trying to convince Musashi to give up swordsmanship and live the rest of his life out with Otsu. Musashi couldn't give up the sword. It was his life, his reason for living. He couldn't simply discard it. Takuan had told him that it was because he sought the sword so haphazardly that he not only nearly died but also received a bum leg, which he struggles to walk on. Musashi was eventually released and continued his journey running into assassins whom each had their own reasons for wanting to kill him. So Musashi, being unable to move his leg, would draw a circle around himself and state that he will kill anyone who enters it. If his opponent wished to flee, he won't chase after them. Of course, no one took the fleeing option and would charge in. Musashi would then use their momentum to kill them. From then on, Musashi, who had attained the title of strongest, finally began to understand what Yagyu meant when he said it was just a word. He may have achieved the title of strongest, but he wasn't. He knew of someone stronger than him. He had met Sasaki Kyojido in Kyoto and saw him split a snowman in half with a twig. No matter what, Musashi could not replicate it. He saw Kyojido's technique and skill, yet he couldn't reach him. He was clearly superior. He also began to think about the people he had killed and how their lives carried him to this point, and yet he can't move on. He can't attain the true strength he has sought for so long. He was considered by many, if not everybody, to be the strongest under the heavens, an invincible swordsman with no equal. This is what Musashi has been training for. He achieved his dream, but to him it was a lie. Not only was he not the strongest, but also not invincible. He can't beat Kyojido, and he could barely walk with his bum leg. At this point, it was starting to feel like all of his hard work was for nothing. All those lives he had taken were no longer stepping stones for him to get stronger, but simply killing without a cause. It was here where Musashi began to understand what true swordsmanship was about. He always saw swordsmanship as a technique to kill your opponent, and he sought to take that technique to new heights. But now he understands what Baiken meant when he mentioned the cycle of killing. Even if he perfected this technique, he will just keep running into people who simply wish to take his life with no goal of improving themselves. He began to realize that he was no different than them, a killer who attempted to gain fame and glory by taking the lives of those who had already attained it. He then met Ito Itosai, a man whose fame and strength was on par with his, or so he thought. He attempted to do the circle trick to convince his opponent to charge him, but Itosai instantly realized that Musashi had a weak leg and proceeded to draw an even bigger circle around Musashi and told him that this is the range of his swing. Musashi was on guard because Itosai kept his right arm hidden. He couldn't tell if that was because he didn't have it or if he was pretending to have lost it. In that instant, Itosai closed the gap and palm thrusted Musashi, sending him flying. Musashi had lost consciousness, and Itosai revealed he still had his right arm, but lost half of his hand in the duel against Kyojiro. Itosai managed to cut Kyojiro's shoulder, but couldn't bring himself to finish him off. Similarly here, Itosai couldn't finish off Musashi because he saw both of them as worthy rivals, who still had room to grow and eventually come to be worthy foes for him to defeat. After regaining consciousness, Musashi begins to question why he began his journey in the first place. He lamented on his past and how he started training, recalling his youth when he first discovered a samurai's corpse in a cave and took his sword to train and duel with. He remembers how it felt when he first began to swing a sword and the mindset he had back then. He wanted to return to that time when he felt he was in his prime mentality. At the same time, we see what happened with Matahachi. His mother succumbed to illness, and instead of shamefully returning to the village, he began telling stories on a bridge, drawing the attention of nearby people. He told the story of him and Musashi. This is when we learn that the story we are reading is being told by an older Matahachi. He then continued the story saying that he knows what happened to Musashi afterwards, despite him not being there. He heard rumors and was able to tell which were true because he knew Musashi the longest. He proceeded to tell the crowd about how Musashi stumbled onto a little orphan boy who had wanted to become his student. The boy didn't know who he was. All he knew is that he wielded a sword and sought tutelage from him. However, Musashi felt this kid was too young to make the same mistake he had made and didn't want to teach him the sword. He didn't want to teach this kid how to take a life, but instead how to give it. He tried to show this kid how to farm despite the villagers telling him it's impossible to grow on the kid's land. Turns out they were right. Inconsistent rainstorms would flood the area, making it impossible to plant seeds. So Musashi created an irrigation system to lead the water away from the field. Then suddenly a locust plague hit the land, killing all of their crops. The village had lost everything, and everyone resounded themselves to death, except for Musashi. He continued to plow the soil and even fended off some bandits. Everyone was inspired by Musashi, except this one old man, Shusaku Taru, who saw him as nothing more than a murderer. Just to clarify, it wasn't because he killed a bandit, it was because this guy hated samurai in general, because he saw them as nothing more than killers incapable of giving life. After months went by, and only Shushaku having decent soil to grow anything, the villagers started to lose hope, but Musashi kept at it. He refused to abandon the people. Even if they gave up, he wasn't. He felt like if he gave this up, he would have to give up on healing his leg as well. Musashi just wasn't the type to take adversity lying down. Eventually, the villagers and the old man began to work together to help each other, and then the soil began to bear fruit. However, the villagers began dying from starvation. They couldn't wait for the crops to grow, so Musashi sought the aid of a samurai who was sent by the Hosokawa to recruit him. These people had been searching for Musashi for a while now, and they finally tracked him down to the village. They attempted to convince him to leave the village and come with them, but he refused to abandon these people. Then the villagers started dying of starvation, and so Musashi decided to accept their request on the condition that they provide the village a lot of food and wait until the first harvest before he finally goes with them. Musashi didn't want everyone's hard work to go to waste, so he caved in and accepted. However, he refused to leave until the harvest, so he stayed there and continued to tend to the fields. Throughout his stay, Musashi had to fight what I'm referring to as his demonic warrior side, which would ooze out of him like tar floating around, his body tempting him to leave. It would state that he is a swordsman who is unrivaled. He shouldn't have to stay here and suffer. He should go out fighting strong foes and taking whatever they had on them. Musashi didn't pay that side of him too much attention. Instead, he focused on his philosophy of what it means to wield a sword properly. He would observe the world around him and compare it to his sword, like how the water is free moving and not locked down by a single shape, or how the earth earth is strong and firm, yet it could also be soft and movable. He began comparing it to his swordsmanship and how he wants to become one with the elements and swing his sword as freely as the water, or be firm yet soft like the earth. This is when Musashi takes all of the trials and tutelage he had received throughout his journey and combines it with his first concept of sword fighting he had, then took the pain and suffering he had been enduring to organize his thoughts and come up with the proper way he should have been wielding his sword. As the days go on, the women began asking Musashi for sword training. They don't have any intention of fighting, but they want to become stronger. Musashi didn't understand. What is the point of swinging a sword if they had no intention of fighting? Still, he eventually decided to teach them. However, he would give confusing instructions, like swing the sword like you don't have any arms. Some time had passed and Musashi received instructions from Shushaku on how to properly tend to the fields and harvest them when the time was ripe. Shushaku was also probably Musashi's most important instructor. He not only taught him about the crops, but also about life. He told Musashi that someone strong like him couldn't notice the weak. The crops they were growing were like weak little babies, and someone who could only notice the strong didn't notice the weak beneath them. After nearly a year in the village and many lessons from Shushaku, Musashi finally perfected his swordsmanship and philosophy. He attained true strength and then set out to Kukata Castle, where the Hosokawa preside. The story is still ongoing, so I'm going to stop here, which is perfect because we finally, after so long, see Musashi understand what Takuan tried to teach him when he was younger. It was to understand the value of life. Musashi's strength didn't exist to take lives, but help them. It's just that Musashi only looked to gain strength to defeat those who are stronger. Hence why he felt so empty after reaching that point. When he became the strongest, there was nowhere else to turn. Why did he become strong? Where does he go next? Who else is there to help him improve and grow to greater heights? He found all of those answers in that little village. From there, he noticed the weak and helpless. He learned to think of others. He swung his sword not to take a life, but to save it. He even learned how weak and feeble people are, and what it means to care for something other than yourself. With this, Musashi grew, and the fear of us not having any development washed away with it. Also, I was happy to see Matahachi finally stop trying to be a samurai and leave the main story. He's still there telling Musashi's tale, but he isn't the same lowlife we had followed for the whole series. Now, hopefully the story from this point is going to focus on Musashi and Kojito's match. And with that, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and remember to keep having fun. See ya!